FPV is a really fun thing if you're into remote control helicopters, multi-rotors or planes. And having done FPV for a year or two now, I thought it would be worthwhile sharing some of my experiences when you're starting out in FPV. Particularly for those people who are looking to start the hobby and maybe looking to get into FPV very quickly. I've had a couple of conversations with people now that have asked about the best way to do it, and I'll give some common sense advice, but also some of my experiences as well. And we'll talk about three things really in this little video. The first will be the model, what you need to think about for that. The second will be around the FPV kit, and finally we'll talk around what you need to think about the first few times you try first person view flying for yourself. The first thing we'll talk about is the model. You need to think about whether or not you're going to be flying a plane or a multi-rotor. The difference between the two is quite significant when you're flying FPV. A plane always travels forward, so there's always momentum, there's always direction, so that is a little bit easier to fly in my opinion, because you're always banking and swooping and you've always got a rough idea of where you are. Multi-rotors tend to be a little bit smaller. They're obviously able to hover, so they can get in tighter places. So if you're looking to fly through things like football goalposts and things on a field, then they are fantastic for that. My suggestion is, if you already have a model that you love that's easy to fly, it's easy to pop a camera and transmitter on the top of that model and fly that first. You don't want to try FPV on a model that you've never really got to grips with. And that brings me on to my second point. Can you fly the model well already? And by well, I mean, can you bring it in to land after a nice long flight successfully 99 times out of 100? Now, if you can, and you're that confident with the model, then it will be a lot easier for you to transition to FPV, because FPV will take away a lot of the cues that you have when you're flying a model, when you're looking at it based on the ground. Third thing is the model trimmed well to fly or hover level? Another thing that you'll find is that because you are concentrating so much on the image, particularly at first with the FPV, is that sometimes you will lose orientation, or what you think is level won't be, and you'll only realize it once you notice that you're looking at the wrong thing in the video. Make sure that before you fly the model, that you carefully take time to trim the model and hover it, so that if you take your hands off the sticks, it should continue level and safe and right itself. A very useful feature is GPS return to home or GPS hold features. This is more for multi-rotors, but GPS return to home can also be fitted easily to aircraft and planes as well. That can be handy when you get into real trouble. You can just flick the switch on the transmitter and flip your goggles up off your eyes, and then follow the model in until you can take back control and land it safely. The first time I ever flew FPV, I got completely disorientated. I did it in winter, and it was a cold day, and the lenses of the goggles fogged up. And because of that, I couldn't see the return to home to display. I wasn't familiar enough with the area I was flying in, and ended up having to ditch it in the next field. Now that's fine, because I actually had some GPS bits and pieces fitted to it that showed me where it had gone down, but it would have been better if I could just flick the switch and it would have come back to me. Check that you can record solid video from the model already. Make sure that when you look at it back through the computer or the screen, that you haven't got that jelly wobbling going on. I have other videos that talk about how to remove vibration from video, but any vibration that you have on a video will also be there through the FPV goggles and make it harder to spot individual bits and pieces, like trees at the edge of the field, a white van parked at the corner. Those pieces will be easier to spot if the image is solid. And finally, for the model, expect to crash. Because you don't have the 3D view typically looking through the goggles or a screen, you might get close to a tree, you might get close to the ground, you might get close to another obstacle, and if you clip that, then you'll crash. If you expect to crash, you won't be disappointed. Next thing to talk about is the actual FPV kit itself. You need to start as cheap as you can. Making sure that you can get into this hobby without having spent £400-500 and then realizing you don't like it is quite a nice way to do it. There are models now that are available that are quite cheap and cheerful, that if you want to, you can get, the Hubsan X4. There are some other bits and pieces that come with a little receiver. It's the transmitter with a screen in it. Those are quite cheap and cheerful ways for kind of £120-130 to try FPV for yourself. But if you already have all the rest of the equipment, then you can think about adding a little camera, a transmitter and a receiver and some form of display. If you can borrow one or get with somebody who already does FPV to try it in a buddy box scenario, that's a great way to start. I've ordered some of the new Hobbyking goggles that are less than £25. They don't have a receiver or head tracking or anything fancy in it, but those are the things that will be great for somebody starting out in the hobby, because they're very cheap and inexpensive, and if it turns out that you don't really like it or it doesn't work for you, then you haven't invested too much cash. Next thing to think about for FPV kit is, when you're starting out, goggles or screen. Now, goggles is where I started. Goggles are far more immersive because they cover your entire eyes. It's like sat in the back of a movie theatre looking at the screen in front of you in a black room. The challenge with goggles is they can fog up, and you also can have issues with focus distance. If you wear glasses and you're particularly long-sighted, you may have issues getting the screen sharp in a way that works for you. Screens are better to see in average daylight. They're much crisper. You can actually have several people looking at the screen at once and they can all enjoy the flight, but they're very poor in bright light. If you want to do FPV in brilliant sunshine, trying to keep that screen at a level where you can comfortably make out all the detail you need to for the flight can be tricky. And finally, we'll talk about the first few times that you actually go out and try it. Again, first thing, expect to crash. It will happen, even if you're an accomplished RC pilot, while you get to grips with flying with limited visibility in 2D. Second big tip, take a spotter. Have a friend with you who can keep an eye on the plane all the time. It's better to have a spotter who is actually familiar with remote control or flying aircraft as well, because they can help you with orientation and other bits and pieces. Third thing, beware of danger. When you try to fly for the first couple of times, take it into the biggest open fields you can find without power lines, posts, people, animals, ideally away from local roads and walkways. That means then if you do get a little confused and your model wanders off course, it isn't going to hit anything or anybody. Too often I've seen people try and do it in a park with lots of trees and end up with the model stuck halfway up a tree within 5 minutes. Test FPV range before you take off. Walk to the farthest part of the field, ideally into the start of the next field or the next part of the park, and put the model down. Have somebody stand with it. Walk back to where you're going to stand to fly the model with your goggles or screen. Flip both on and make sure that with the motors running on the model that you can still get a nice crisp picture. You don't want to lose the picture within half of the distance to the edge of the field that you think you've got, and that's when it starts to get complicated and panic sets in. You have to rip the model, the goggles off your face, and you have to then try and establish which way it's pointing, get your spotter to help you and bring it back. That's why the GPS return to home feature can be really handy. Before you actually try FPV in the area though, it's always worthwhile using one of the batteries in your pack to start the model off, get it flying around, make sure it's trimmed okay, just check for any particular crosswinds or weirdness that's going on, and just get the feel of the model in your fingers before then you land it, put a fresh battery on and pop the goggles on. Start off slow. Put the model nice and far away from you, 30-40 yards ideally, so that when you do take off, it's not going to wander back and hit you. And just concentrate initially on just pootling around. Keep the altitude low, gentle flight, just make sure that you can see the ground and just concentrate on just moving around and hovering. Don't get too carried away trying to do what you see in the videos where they go 2.5 miles away and they're looking at the horizon. That will come. Practice initially for the first half a dozen batteries, just flying around, maximum kind of the height of trees, so you can control it and you know what you're doing. Interesting one, this is one that I found out. A seat is a good idea. A little camping seat that you can take with you that you can sit on is a really good choice. There's a reason why the guys in things like Flight Test are all sat when they're flying FPV. It's because actually it can be quite disorientating and make you a little bit dizzy and seasick when you're trying to stand as well as look at a screen that's tilting and flying around, where you're trying to put yourself in that position. So if you're sat down, it means that you don't have to worry about getting dizzy or falling over or stumbling around as you're trying to bank and turn the craft using FPV. And the final part for the few times is beware of distractions. Noise, insects, sunshine. You don't want to have to try and swat something off your leg in the middle of an FPV flight. I found that actually putting earbuds in that actually give me the noise of the engine is really useful. When I first started out, flying the aircraft past me via FPV or in front of me down the field was really disconcerting, because although I had a picture inside the model, I heard the noise of the engine increase and then decrease as it went past me. That really took my eye off the ball, so to speak. So, just be aware of those things too. So hopefully for those of you who are looking at FPV or getting into it, there's some food for thought there about making sure that you can get into the hobby safely and cheaply and enjoy it and have a great time. This list isn't meant as a, you must do this. This is only my experience, but hopefully for those of you out there who are getting into this, it's a useful thing. If you need any more help or information or detail, then please pop me a message, comment or subscribe to the video, or if you want to have a chat, my help out channel on Google Plus is always available. Thanks for watching. Speak to you soon.